The knife slipped from Margaret Chen's trembling fingers and clattered against the kitchen floor, the third time that morning. At 63 years old, her hands had finally betrayed her, just like everything else in her life. She stood in the empty house that still smelled faintly of Robert's aftershave, 3 months after they'd buried him, and felt the familiar weight of silence pressing against her chest. The police had called it a random mugging gone wrong. But Margaret knew better. She'd seen the tattoo on the man's wrist in the security footage, the same serpent insignia that Robert had whispered about in his final, delirious moments at the hospital. The serpents, they found me. I'm sorry, Maggie. Her husband had been a good man, a quiet accountant who volunteered at the youth center and never missed their Sunday walks in Piedmont Park. What the world didn't know, what Margaret herself had only discovered in the locked drawer after his death, was that Robert Chen had once been a different person entirely. The documents told a story of witness protection, of testimony against a criminal organization, of a life lived in the shadows of fear. And now that fear had caught up with him, leaving Margaret alone with a rage so profound it felt like drowning. That's when she found the letter. Tucked inside Robert's hidden files was an envelope addressed to her in his careful handwriting. If you're reading this, I'm gone. And if you want the truth, go to New Mexico. Find Joseph Windtalker. He'll know what to do. Beneath it was an address in the Mescalero Apache Reservation and a single photograph of Robert as a young man, standing beside an elderly Native American man with eyes like flint, both holding ornate knives with carved handles. Margaret had spent her entire life being reasonable. She'd been a librarian for 40 years, a woman who resolved conflicts with quiet words and recommended the right books for healing hearts. Violence was foreign to her vocabulary. But as she stood in that too-quiet kitchen, picking up the fallen knife once more, something ancient and primal stirred in her chest. This wasn't about revenge in the Hollywood sense, it was about justice, about honoring the man she'd loved, about refusing to let evil win through her silence and submission. The drive to New Mexico took 3 days. Margaret watched the landscape transform from Georgia's green humidity to the stark, beautiful desert of the Southwest. She'd told no one where she was going. Her daughter Amy had called twice, worried about her mother's state of mind, suggesting grief counseling and antidepressants. But Margaret wasn't grieving anymore, she was transforming. Each mile that passed beneath her tires felt like shedding an old skin, the timid widow disappearing in the rearview mirror. Joseph Windtalker's home was a modest adobe structure at the edge of the reservation, surrounded by red rock formations that glowed like fire in the setting sun. When she knocked, the door opened to reveal a man in his 80s, his face a roadmap of life's journeys, his long gray hair pulled back in a traditional style. His eyes, those same flint-sharp eyes from the photograph, studied her for a long moment before he spoke. "You're Robert's wife," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am. I was." Margaret's voice cracked. "He sent me to you." Joseph nodded slowly, then stepped aside. "Then you'd better come in." The interior of his home was sparse but purposeful, traditional Apache artwork on the walls, a wood-burning stove, and along one entire wall, a display of knives that took Margaret's breath away. They ranged from ancient stone blades to modern tactical designs, each one positioned with reverent care. "Robert saved my grandson's life," Joseph said, settling into a worn leather chair and gesturing for Margaret to sit. 20 years ago, he was an FBI accountant who discovered money being funneled to fund a drug operation that was destroying our young people. He could have looked the other way, most did. But he didn't. He testified, knowing what it would cost him. "When the serpents put a price on his head, I taught him to survive. Taught him our ways with the blade, not for killing, but for protection. For discipline. For peace." "They found him anyway," Margaret whispered. "Yes." Joseph's eyes grew distant. "The serpents are patient. They're also expanding. I've heard reports of them recruiting young people in Atlanta, Phoenix, Denver. They're like a cancer, growing in the shadows." He leaned forward. "You came here for revenge. I can see it in your eyes, the same fire Robert had when he first came to me. Margaret met his gaze steadily. I came here to learn what my husband learned. I came here because I can't spend the rest of my life being helpless. Revenge is a poison, Joseph said quietly. It will consume you from the inside. Then what do you suggest? Margaret's voice rose with frustration. That I just accept it. Go back to my empty house and pretend everything is fine. Let them win. Joseph stood and walked to the knife wall, running his weathered hand along the handles. I suggest you learn the true meaning of the blade. In Apache tradition, the knife is not a weapon of aggression, it's a tool of protection, of provision, of sacred duty. We teach that to take up the knife is to take up responsibility for your community. He turned to face her. If I train you, it won't be to make you a killer. It will be to make you a guardian. Margaret stood as well, her small frame straightening with purpose. Then teach me to be a guardian. Teach me what Robert learned. Because those people are still out there, still hurting families, still destroying lives. If I can learn to protect others from what happened to me, then Robert's death won't be meaningless. Something shifted in Joseph's expression, a glimmer of respect, perhaps even hope. You understand it will be difficult. I don't care about your age, but your body will fight you. Your mind will want to quit. Most people who say they want to learn give up within a week. I raised 2 children, worked full-time, and took care of my mother through Alzheimer's, Margaret said firmly. I'm familiar with difficult. Joseph allowed himself a small smile. Very well, Margaret Chen. We begin at dawn. Wear clothes you can move in. And bring that rage you're carrying, we'll transform it into something useful. That night, Margaret lay in the small guest room Joseph had offered, staring at the ceiling beams and listening to the desert wind whisper against the windows. She thought of Robert, of the secret life he'd lived, of the courage it took to stand against darkness. She thought of her daughter, of her grandchildren, of all the innocent people who might be the serpent's next victims. And she thought of herself, not as the quiet librarian or the grieving widow, but as something new, something fierce and protective. Outside, a coyote howled at the moon, and Margaret closed her eyes, ready for the dawn and whatever transformation it would bring. Dawn arrived with the subtlety of a shout. Joseph knocked on Margaret's door at 5:30 a.m., and within minutes she found herself standing in the cool desert morning, her breath visible in small clouds. Her body already ached from the unfamiliar bed, and she'd barely started. We begin with emptiness, Joseph said, standing before her in simple cotton pants and a weathered shirt. Empty your mind of revenge. Empty your hands of tension. Empty your heart of hate. Only then can we fill you with purpose. What followed was nothing like Margaret had imagined. There were no dramatic knife-fighting lessons, no action movie scenarios. Instead, Joseph taught her to breathe, deep, intentional breaths that came from her belly. He taught her to stand, distributing her weight properly, finding her center of gravity. He taught her to move, slowly and deliberately, through positions that stretched muscles she'd forgotten existed. The knife is an extension of your intention, Joseph explained as the morning sun climbed higher. If your intention is clouded, the blade is useless. Worse, it's dangerous. By the end of the first day, Margaret had yet to touch a knife. She'd held stances until her legs trembled, performed breathing exercises until she felt dizzy, and walked in patterns across Joseph's yard until her feet knew the path by memory. She collapsed into bed that night wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. But she returned at dawn. And the next dawn. And the next. Slowly, the training evolved. Joseph introduced her to the knives, first teaching her to hold them properly, to feel their weight and balance. In Apache tradition, the blade is blessed, he explained, showing her how to grip a handle. It carries the spirit of protection. When you hold it, you hold a sacred trust. Margaret learned to cut, not flesh, but rope, vegetables, wood. Joseph taught her precision, control, the difference between force and finesse. Anyone can stab wildly, he said. But to truly master the blade, you must make every movement intentional, every cut purposeful. Weeks became months. Margaret's hands, once trembling and uncertain, grew steady and strong. Her body, initially resistant to the demand she placed on it, began to adapt. She lost weight, gained muscle, moved with a grace she'd never possessed. But more than physical transformation, something deeper was changing. The rage that had driven her to New Mexico was still there, but it had been refined, like metal through fire, into something more sustainable: determination. Joseph shared stories as they trained, tales of Apache warriors who fought not from hatred but from love of their people, legends of women who protected their communities with fierce devotion. True strength, he told her, comes not from the desire to hurt those who hurt you, but from the commitment to prevent them from hurting others. One evening, as they sat by his fire, Joseph revealed more about Robert. "Your husband could have disappeared completely, you know. The FBI offered him a new identity, a fresh start somewhere the serpents would never find him. But he refused to completely erase himself because he'd met you. He said you were worth the risk of keeping some threads of his old life." Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "I didn't know. He never told me about any of this. He was protecting you. But now..." Joseph looked at her with those penetrating eyes. "Now you're protecting his memory. And more importantly, you're becoming someone who can protect others." After 6 months of training, Joseph finally spoke the words Margaret had been waiting for: "You're ready." They stood in his training area, the New Mexico sun beating down, and he handed her a knife unlike any she'd held before, the handle intricately carved with Apache symbols, the blade perfectly balanced. "This was Robert's," Joseph said. "I made it for him 20 years ago. Now it's yours." Margaret's fingers closed around the handle, and she felt the weight of responsibility settle into her bones. "What do I do now?" "You go home," Joseph said. "And you listen. You watch. You gather information about the serpents, carefully, quietly, like the librarian you were. And when the time comes, you act not as an avenger, but as a guardian." The drive back to Atlanta felt different from the journey out. Margaret was different, not just physically, but fundamentally. She returned to her house, to her life, but she inhabited them differently now. She reached out to the youth center where Robert had volunteered and offered her time. She listened to the teenagers, heard their stories, learned about the drug dealers pressuring them, the gang members recruiting them. And she heard whispers of the serpents. Using skills she'd honed through 40 years as a research librarian, Margaret began to investigate. She discovered patterns: disappearances, overdoses, families destroyed. She connected dots that police, overwhelmed and under-resourced, had missed. She found a network of criminality that spanned cities, and at its heart in Atlanta, a man named Victor Serpa who operated behind the legitimate facade of a used car dealership. But Margaret didn't go to Serpa with a knife in her hand and vengeance in her heart. Instead, she went to Detective Lisa Morrison, a young investigator she'd met through the youth center, and presented her with 6 months of meticulous research: names, dates, connections, evidence gathered with the patient precision of a librarian and the focused determination of an Apache student. "Mrs. Chen," Detective Morrison said, staring at the organized files spread across her desk, this is incredible. How did you compile all this?" "I had time," Margaret said simply. "And motivation. These people killed my husband. But more importantly, they're killing this community. Every day they operate is another family destroyed, another young person lost." The investigation that followed took 8 more months. Margaret worked quietly alongside the police, providing insight, making connections, occasionally, when necessary, using her unconventional skills to protect vulnerable witnesses who were being threatened by serpent enforcers. She never sought the spotlight, never revealed the full extent of her training. She became what Joseph had taught her to be, a guardian working in the shadows. When the arrests finally came, they were extensive. Victor Serpa and 17 members of his organization were taken into custody. The evidence was overwhelming: so thorough and well documented that even expensive lawyers couldn't create reasonable doubt. The Serpent Network in Atlanta was destroyed. On the day of Serpa's sentencing, Margaret sat in the courtroom gallery, anonymous among the crowd. As the judge handed down 25 years to life, Margaret didn't feel triumph or satisfaction. She felt something quieter, more profound, peace. Robert's death had been avenged not through violence, but through justice. The rage that had consumed her had been transformed into protection for others. That evening, she called Joseph. "It's done," she said simply. "Good." She could hear the smile in his voice. "And you? How do you feel?" Margaret looked around her house, no longer empty, but filled with photos of her grandchildren, books from the youth center kids she mentored, light streaming through clean windows. "I feel like I found something I didn't know I was looking for. Purpose. Strength. Peace. That's the true revenge," Joseph said quietly. "Not destroying those who hurt you, but refusing to let them destroy you. You've honored Robert's memory not by becoming like the serpents, but by becoming more fully yourself, strong, protective, purposeful." After hanging up, Margaret walked to her mantel where Robert's photograph sat beside the Apache knife Joseph had given her. She touched both gently, then turned to her computer where an email waited from Detective Morrison. "Mrs. Chen, we've identified similar serpent operations in 3 other cities. Would you be willing to consult?" Margaret smiled, not the tentative, polite smile of the woman she'd been, but the quiet, fierce smile of the woman she'd become. She'd been trained by Apache knife masters not to become a warrior of revenge, but a guardian of justice. And that work, she realized, was just beginning. She typed her response, "Yes. Tell me where to start." Outside, the Atlanta evening settled into twilight, and somewhere in the city, young people walked safer streets because one widow had transformed her grief into action, her rage into protection, her pain into purpose. Margaret Chen, librarian, widow, student of the Apache Way, had discovered that the greatest revenge against darkness wasn't matching it with more darkness, but illuminating it with relentless, compassionate light. And that light, she knew, would continue to shine.